I started work in 1941, and at that time, I was very fortunate because I used to go out for father for measuring machine guards in all the places that make tools. So it'd be anybody from making things like this that we see here, up to making things like, I can remember going to Hadfields, making tanks, and the component parts. Well, everybody knows what a tank looks like, and the top part that turns round with the gun on it, they were turning those on a lathe, and the man who's operating the lathe, the turner as it's called, he was sat on top of the tool post, which normally is only a tiny thing, no bigger than the size of my hand, and he sat on it, and it's a huge thing, massive, and the tank top's all being turned round. It's about 3 or 4 metres across, so that's very impressive. Into steelworks where they're melting steel and rolling steel, and they're snaking lots of steel running out at you at 30 mile an hour. A piece of steel bar, red hot, comes flying out at you, and you've got to get out of the way quick. All sorts of things that you went into these works, noises, smells, people, of course, that were doing these jobs.
You must have come across some incredible characters over the years.
By our very nature, what can I say, the nature of our job it was very tenuous. It was it's not the word quite, very quick. You were sort of in there, you might work there for a few days and then come out because you'd done your job. So you didn't really get time to know people terribly. I can remember going into Stanley Works in the 40s, during the war, and putting guards on machines, some very old machines that were all belt driven, but alongside them in the same workshop were a series of very modern machines that were making bullets, and this juxtaposition of this old making hand tools and the new making bullets with the very up-to-date American machines, it was very striking. So I don't know, so many memories, I suppose, but I was very fortunate to see all that. Although a lot of the processes you don't know about intimately. I can remember going to one place called George Clark's on Penistone Road, who was what we call a rolling mill, where you're reducing steel down to a sheet form, and the basic material they were using was railway lines, and railway lines would come in about 3 or 4 metres long on a horse-drawn dray, and 2 men levered them off and they dropped on the floor. And afterwards, when the horse-drawn dray had gone, the men would cut with a colt chisel, a big hammer, would put a nick in the steel every so often. It was a certain distance, and then they would put it in a machine, and the machine was what they call a crocodile. It was a massive machine, and they'd have to lift this railway line up between these 2 men and drop the notch opposite into this machine. And there was 2 fixed jaws and a single one that's moving in and out. They drop the bar in, and the next time the ram comes up, it breaks the railway line, because that's why the notch has been put in it. It's a point of weakness. It breaks the railway line very simply, very quickly. No sewing, done in an instant. That gets put into a furnace and brought up to a bright red heat. When it is up to temperature, they take it to the rolling mill, and the rolling mill is a series of steel rolls, maybe I suppose in that instance about 2 to 3 metres wide, and probably that sort of diameter. They push this piece of railway line up to it. The end of the rolls have a flywheel, that is about 4 metres diameter, driven from an absolutely enormous gas engine. They have a gas engine down at Kelham Island. The ones they had then, that's a fairly new one, the ones they had then were about 4 times that size. Massive things. And they'd got cotton driving ropes, which were about 1.25 inch diameter, and there'd be 10 ropes, all running from this gas engine to the massive flywheel. And the flywheel's whizzing round. And I was stood there at the side, and you're sort of waiting to see what's going to happen. And all of a sudden the roller will give this piece of red hot steel a push up to the rolls, and the rolls then they gripped it. And momentarily, because this huge flywheel's whizzing round, and that's where all the stored energy is. And what happens then is that this flywheel, for the briefest of a second, stops, and all the cotton ropes are pulled tight on one side, and on the other tight they've all taken a dip like that, and you're thinking, my God, what's going to happen next? Something's going to bust. At any rate, all of a sudden what happens is that it grabs hold of this steel and it passes it through, and all this energy, as I say, is being going round. You stood at the side of it while it's happening. The fellas who were running it, of course, they'd seen it millions of times, and it made no difference to them. But to see it first time, frightening beyond belief. Frightening.
How old were you at that point?
16, something like that. Go to Sammy Fox's steelworks when they were melting up there, 150-ton furnace. And they had, this is much later by the way, what they did, it was electrically melted, this furnace, and there were huge copper cables, probably 50 millimetres or 75 millimetres across, perhaps 20 of them, feeding electricity. They had their own power line coming in, all their own pylons delivering electricity to that steelworks. They used that much electricity from the grid. They had their own grid. And once it started melting, there's the empty furnace, and then a crane comes along and drops a load of scrap in. And then they bring a lid across and close it down. When the scrap goes in, there's sparks everywhere because there's residual heat in the thing. And they shut the lid down, and then they decide to melt. Well, what they do, there's some huge electrodes which are made of carbon. They bring these electrodes down, and at some point, when the bottom gets into position, they put the electricity on, and there's an arc comes from that to the scrap, and the amount of power, you stood sort of not all that far away but safe enough out of the way, but what's happening, all these cables, massively heavy cables, all start writhing like snakes, and you think, my God, the amount of power that's being pumped into that lot. Absolutely enthralling and frightening beyond belief, and the visual effects are equally so. Wonderful place Sheffield was, wonderful. All the skills of the different people. Have got some pieces of steel hardly thicker than that pencil lead that's been forged on a big hammer by people known as tilters who did that class of work. And of course you can do much heavier stuff as well, weighing many tons as well. So we did everything in Sheffield. Wonderful. I feel very privileged to have lived through that time, really, and seen it all to happen, which I suppose gives me a fair inkling into knowing how things, when I look at things, I can visualise how they've been made. And that's many people can't do that. But I have the ability to be able to do it. Feel very privileged.